The morning had started like any other wedding day in Las Vegas. The little white chapel buzzed with excitement, its walls adorned with fresh, white roses that filled the air with their sweet scent. Chloe Matthews stood in the small preparation room, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her veil one last time. The vintage mirror reflected back an image of perfection, her dress, a simple but elegant white gown that she'd chosen months ago with her mom, fit like a dream. "You look beautiful, honey," her mother said, wiping away a tear. "Ryan won't know what hit him." Chloe smiled, trying to calm the butterflies in her stomach. She'd been dating Ryan Cooper for 3 years, and when he proposed last Christmas, she hadn't hesitated to say yes. They'd chosen Vegas for its simplicity. No fussy wedding planners, no year-long preparations, just their closest friends and family in an intimate ceremony. The chapel coordinator poked her head in, clipboard in hand. 20 minutes, ladies," she announced cheerfully. Chloe's bridesmaids, Sarah and Katie, hurried to make final adjustments to their powder blue dresses. As the minutes ticked by, Chloe's excitement grew. She'd always dreamed of this moment, walking down the aisle toward the man she loved. Everything was perfect, the flowers, the music, even the weather had cooperated, offering a rare mild day in the Nevada desert. The coordinator returned, this time with a slight frown. "The groom hasn't checked in yet," she said, trying to keep her voice casual. "I'm sure he's just stuck in traffic." Vegas can be unpredictable. Chloe checked her phone. No messages from Ryan. She sent him a quick text. "Everything okay?
Can't wait to see you."
Red heart. 10 more minutes passed. Then 20. The butterflies in Chloe's stomach turned to lead. Sarah tried calling Ryan's best man, Mike, but it went straight to voicemail. The guests in the chapel started shifting uncomfortably in their seats, their whispered conversations growing louder with each passing minute. Chloe's father appeared at the door, his face tight with concern. "Sweetheart," he started, but before he could finish, Mike finally called back. Sarah's face fell as she listened, and Chloe knew. She just knew. "He's not coming," Sarah said softly, ending the call. "Mike says he's not coming, Chloe." The words hit Chloe like a physical blow. Her knees buckled, and Katie rushed to steady her. The room spun as the reality of the situation sank in. Ryan had left her at the altar. No explanation, no goodbye, nothing. "I need to get out of here," Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible. The coordinator, experienced in handling wedding day disasters, quickly ushered the guests out through a side door, while Chloe's parents shielded her from view. Back in her hotel room, Chloe sat on the edge of the bed, still in her wedding dress. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from concerned friends and family, but she couldn't bring herself to look at them. The humiliation was overwhelming. Everyone would know by now, the bride left at the altar, like some bad movie cliché. Hours passed, and humiliation gave way to anger. How dare he? After 3 years together, after all their plans and promises, how could Ryan just walk away without even a word? The more Chloe thought about it, the more her rage grew. She deserved answers at the very least. Without really thinking it through, Chloe grabbed her car keys. She was still wearing her wedding dress, but she didn't care. She needed to see Ryan, needed to hear him explain himself. As she passed through the hotel kitchen on her way to the parking lot, her hand closed around a knife from the prep counter. She didn't plan to use it, not really. She just wanted to make sure Ryan would listen. The drive to Ryan's house was a blur. Vegas's neon lights streaked past her windows like shooting stars, and her wedding veil fluttered in the air conditioning. Some small part of her brain knew this was crazy, knew she should turn around and go back to the hotel. But the larger part, the part consumed by pain and rage, kept her foot on the gas. When she pulled up to Ryan's house, his car was in the driveway. The porch light was on, casting a yellow glow over the welcome mat they'd picked out together at Target just last month. Chloe gripped the knife in her hand, its weight both frightening and reassuring. She didn't know it then, but this moment, standing on Ryan's porch in her wedding dress, grief and anger warring in her heart, would be the last normal moment of her life. Everything that happened next would unfold like a nightmare, leaving everyone who knew them wondering how love could turn to tragedy so quickly. Later, People would ask themselves what they would have done in Chloe's situation. The story spread across the city like wildfire, appearing on local news sites and social media feeds. Comments poured in from strangers who'd never met either of them, each person convinced they would have handled it differently. "I would have just gone home," they'd say, shaking their heads at their phones. "No man is worth throwing your life away for." Others understood the rage, admitted they might have snapped too. The wedding videos, captured by well-meaning guests, showed the moment Chloe realized Ryan wasn't coming. They went viral within hours, the beautiful bride's smile fading, the confusion in her eyes turning to devastation. But none of them had lived through it. None of them had felt the burning humiliation of standing in a wedding dress while whispers spread through the crowd. None of them had 3 years of memories suddenly turning sour in their minds, every happy moment now tainted by betrayal. Chloe stood at Ryan's door, her knuckles white around the knife handle. Inside, she could hear movement. He was home, probably hiding from her like a coward. The first knock was gentle, almost hesitant. When there was no response, she knocked harder, her wedding ring making a sharp sound against the wood. "Ryan," she called out, her voice cracking. "I know you're in there. Open the door." More movement inside, then silence. Chloe's free hand curled into a fist, and she pounded on the door. "You owe me an explanation. You can't just leave me at the altar and hide." The porch light flickered, casting strange shadows across her white dress. A neighbor's dog started barking, and somewhere down the street, a car alarm went off. The ordinary nighttime sounds of the neighborhood felt surreal, like background noise in a movie scene. Finally, the lock clicked. The door opened just enough for Chloe to see Ryan's face. He looked tired, his usually neat hair messy, like he'd been running his hands through it. He hadn't even changed out of his regular clothes. No sign that he'd ever intended to make it to the wedding. "Chloe," he said, his voice flat. "You need to go home." Those 4 words, "you need to go home," hit harder than silence ever could. Chloe felt something snap inside her, like a rubber band pulled too tight. She pushed against the door, surprising Ryan with her strength, and forced her way inside. The house looked exactly the same as it had yesterday when she'd stopped by to drop off his boutonniere. The coffee mug she'd bought him still sat on the counter, the one with the stupid joke about coding that had made him laugh. Their photos still hung on the walls. Nothing had changed, except everything had. "Go home." Chloe's voice rose. "Go home? I was supposed to be home with you tonight. We were supposed to be married." Ryan backed away, holding his hands up like he was dealing with a wild animal. His eyes darted to the knife in her hand, but he didn't mention it. "I needed space," he said, as if that explained everything. "I couldn't go through with it. It didn't feel right." "Didn't feel right?" Chloe laughed, but it sounded wrong even to her own ears. "And you couldn't have figured that out before I put on this dress? Before my entire family flew in from Ohio? Before you let me stand there like an idiot?" She advanced into the living room, still gripping the knife. Ryan retreated until his back hit the wall next to their engagement photo. The irony wasn't lost on either of them, their smiling faces looking down at this nightmare scene. "You're being hysterical," Ryan said, his voice taking on that condescending tone she'd always hated. "This is exactly why I couldn't marry you. Everything's always such a drama with you." The knife felt heavier in Chloe's hand. The kitchen fluorescent lights reflected off the blade, sending light patterns dancing across the walls. She took another step forward, and for the first time, real fear flashed across Ryan's face. "Drama," she whispered. "You haven't seen drama yet." Outside, the neighbor's dog had stopped barking. The night had gone oddly quiet, as if holding its breath. Neither of them knew it, but someone had already called 911, reporting strange noises and a woman in a wedding dress breaking into the house. Help was on the way, but it wouldn't arrive in time to prevent what happened next. Time seemed to slow down in Ryan's living room. The knife trembled in Chloe's hand as they faced each other, 3 years of love twisted into something unrecognizable. Ryan's eyes kept darting between her face and the blade, his breath coming in short bursts. "Put the knife down," he said, trying to sound calm. "This isn't you, Chloe. You're just upset." Upset. The word tasted bitter in her mouth. You have no idea what I am right now. Why couldn't you just tell me? Why did you have to humiliate me like that? Ryan's face hardened. I tried telling you for months that things weren't working. You never listened. You just kept pushing the wedding, the house hunting, the baby talk. It was suffocating. Each word hit Chloe like a slap. She remembered all their conversations differently. His enthusiastic nods when they toured houses, his smile when they discussed having kids. Had it all been lies? Had she imagined the love in his eyes? You're lying, she said, her voice shaking. You weren't trying to tell me anything. You were playing along, making plans, promising me forever. And then you just disappeared. She waved the knife for emphasis, and Ryan flinched. Careful with that thing, he snapped.
See?
This is exactly what I'm talking about. You're completely out of control. The condescension in his voice pushed her over the edge. Out of control? You want to see out of control? She stepped closer, the knife pointed at his chest. Start talking. Tell me the real reason. Is there someone else? This is insane, Ryan muttered. He glanced toward the front door, calculating his chances. I'm not doing this with you. Not while you're acting crazy. The word crazy echoed in Chloe's head, drowning out everything else. Before she realized what was happening, Ryan lunged forward, trying to grab her wrist. They struggled, a bizarre dance in the living room they'd furnished together. Her wedding dress tangled around their legs as they grappled for control of the knife. Let go, Ryan shouted, his fingers digging into her arm. Chloe, stop. She didn't remember driving the knife forward. Later, she wouldn't be able to tell the police if she'd meant to stab him or if he'd pulled her arm during the struggle. All she knew was the sudden give of flesh, the horrible sound Ryan made, and the warm blood spreading across his blue cotton shirt. Ryan staggered backward, his hands going to his chest. The knife clattered to the floor, its blade stained red. For a moment, they just stared at each other, shocked by how quickly everything had changed. Chloe. Ryan's voice was barely a whisper. He slumped against the wall, leaving a red smear as he slid to the floor. The engagement photo above his head tilted crooked. Reality crashed back in with devastating force. Chloe rushed forward, pressing her hands against the wound. Her white dress soaked up his blood like tissue paper. No, 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 she chanted. I didn't mean to. Ryan, I'm sorry. Please. Her hands shook as she fumbled for her phone, dialing 911. The operator's voice seemed to come from very far away as Chloe tried to explain what had happened. She couldn't stop looking at Ryan's face, watching as his skin turned ashen. Stay with me, she begged between answering the operator's questions. Help is coming. Just stay awake. But Ryan's eyes had already glazed over, his breathing shallow and irregular. By the time the police sirens wailed in the distance, he wasn't breathing at all. Chloe's wedding dress, now more red than white, clung to her skin as she sat beside him, still pressing uselessly against the wound. The front door burst open, flooding the room with flashlight beams. Police. Hands where we can see them. Chloe raised her bloody hands slowly, her eyes never leaving Ryan's face. The officers approached cautiously, their boots crunching on broken glass from a fallen picture frame. One of them checked Ryan's pulse, while another gently pulled Chloe away. He jumped at me, she said numbly as they handcuffed her. I was just trying to talk to him. He tried to grab the knife. Outside, red and blue lights painted the neighborhood in alternating colors. Neighbors stood in their driveways, watching as the bride they'd seen arriving minutes earlier was led to a police car. Some filmed with their phones, ensuring that by morning, everyone would know what had happened in the house on Cedar Street. In the back of the police car, Chloe stared at her reflection in the window. Her mascara had run, leaving black trails down her cheeks. Her carefully styled hair had come loose, and her mother's pearl necklace was spattered with blood. She barely recognized herself. I need to call my lawyer, she said quietly to no one in particular. The reality of what she'd done was starting to sink in, heavy as lead in her stomach. This wasn't a nightmare she could wake up from. This was her new reality, from bride to suspect in the space of a few hours. The interrogation room at the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department was nothing like the ones on TV. Instead of a dark, intimidating space, It was harshly lit and uncomfortably bland. Chloe sat there for hours, still wearing her blood-stained wedding dress, while detectives built their case against her. "Walk us through it again," Detective Martinez said, her voice tired but patient. Walked the jury through the timeline, Chloe's angry texts, her trip to the hotel kitchen for the knife, the drive to Ryan's house. Security footage showed her walking purposefully through the hotel, her white dress flowing behind her as she entered the kitchen area. "Notice how calm she appears," Thompson pointed out. "This is not someone acting in the heat of the moment." The prosecution's first witnesses were the hotel staff who'd seen Chloe that day. A kitchen worker described how she'd seemed normal, even smiled at him as she passed through. The wedding coordinator tearfully recounted the moment they realized Ryan wasn't coming. "She just changed," the coordinator said. "One minute she was this happy bride, and the next, I've never seen someone's eyes go so cold." But it was Ryan's neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, whose testimony hit hardest. The elderly woman described hearing the confrontation through her open window. "She was screaming at him," Mrs. Henderson recalled, her voice shaking. "I heard her say, 'You're going to regret this.' Then there was a lot of noise, things breaking. When I looked out, I saw him through the window, backing away from her. He looked scared." Chen's cross-examinations focused on dismantling the prosecution's portrait of premeditation. She got the kitchen worker to admit he hadn't actually seen Chloe take the knife. The wedding coordinator broke down crying when Chen had her describe the cruel and unusual emotional trauma of being abandoned at the altar. But it was during Chloe's own testimony that the courtroom truly fell silent. She walked to the stand on shaky legs, took the oath, and began to tell her story. "I loved him," she said simply, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'd been together for 3 years. He helped me through my dad's heart attack. I supported him when he switched careers. We were a team. At least, I thought we were." Chun guided her through the events leading up to the wedding. Chloe described their excitement planning the ceremony, how Ryan had seemed happy, engaged in all the decisions.
"He picked the venue," she said.
"He chose the date. If he was having doubts, why didn't he just tell me?" When they reached the events at Ryan's house, Chloe's composure cracked. "I didn't go there to hurt him," she insisted, tears rolling down her cheeks. "I just needed to understand. But he was so cold, so dismissive. He called me crazy, said I was suffocating him. When he lunged at me..." Objection. Thompson stood. The defendant's version contradicts the physical evidence. The judge sustained the objection, but the jury had heard enough. Some of them wiped away tears of their own, while others looked troubled, scribbling notes. Ryan's parents sat in the front row every day, his mother clutching a photo of him at his college graduation. When they testified, they described a son who'd felt trapped but was too kind to hurt anyone's feelings. "He should have been honest," his father admitted. "But that's no reason to take his life." The testimony that seemed to affect the jury most came from Dr. James Morton, the state's forensic expert. Using detailed diagrams, he showed how the angle of the knife wound contradicted Chloe's claim of self-defense. "The evidence suggests Mr. Cooper was moving away from his attacker," Morton explained. "The thrust came from an advancing position, not a defensive one." Each day, the gallery filled with spectators, women's rights activists arguing that Chloe was a victim of emotional abuse, domestic violence advocates pointing out that men could be victims too. The case had touched a nerve, forcing people to examine their own relationships and wonder what they might do if pushed to the breaking point. Everything changed on day 7 of the trial. The prosecution had saved their most damaging evidence for last, Chloe's complete phone records from the weeks leading up to the wedding. Thompson stood before the jury, holding printouts that would shatter the defense's narrative. "Your Honor, the state would like to present Exhibit 47, Thompson said, passing copies to the jury. "These are text messages sent by the defendant in the month before the wedding." Chloe felt her stomach drop as her own words appeared on the courtroom screens. Messages she'd forgotten about, sent late at night when her anxiety peaked and her darkest thoughts emerged. 3 weeks before the wedding. "I swear if he bails on me, he'll regret ever meeting me." 2 weeks before. "Sometimes I think about what I'd do if he tried to leave." It scares me how angry I get. The morning of the wedding. If he thinks he can humiliate me like this, he's got another thing coming. Nobody does this to me. Chen's objections were overruled. The messages painted a picture of escalating threats and obsessive behavior that no amount of contextualizing could soften. Chloe watched the jurors' faces as they read, saw their expressions shift from sympathy to concern. Would the defendant care to explain these messages? Thompson asked, his voice deceptively gentle. Chloe looked at Chen, who nodded slightly. I was stressed about the wedding, she said, her voice small in the quiet courtroom. Everyone gets cold feet, has dark thoughts.
I didn't mean any of it.
Just like you didn't mean to bring a knife to Ryan's house? Objection.
Chen stood.
Argumentative. Sustained, the judge said, but the damage was done. In the conference room during the lunch break, Chen paced while Chloe sat with her head in her hands. The text messages had blown apart their narrative of a spontaneous emotional breakdown. We need to change strategy, Chen said finally. The jury won't buy temporary insanity anymore. Not with those texts showing premeditation. Dr. Sullivan, their psychiatric expert, suggested a new approach. We focus on cumulative trauma, she explained. The texts don't show premeditation. They show a woman experiencing severe anxiety and abandonment fears, which were then catastrophically triggered by the wedding day rejection. Chloe barely heard them planning. She kept reading her own messages, displayed in stark black and white. Had she really written those things? She remembered being anxious about the wedding, having moments of doubt and fear, but seeing her thoughts laid out like that made her feel like she was reading about a stranger. When court resumed, Chen called Dr. Sullivan back to the stand. The psychiatrist explained how chronic anxiety and relationship trauma could create a pressure cooker of emotions. These messages, she testified, are actually a cry for help. They show someone who needed intervention and support, not someone plotting a murder. But the prosecution wasn't finished. They had one final piece of evidence, surveillance footage from Ryan's neighbor's security camera. The video showed Chloe arriving at Ryan's house, the knife clearly visible in her hand before she even reached the door. Does this look like someone having a breakdown? Thompson asked the jury during his redirect. Or someone who came prepared to do exactly what she threatened in those messages. The footage played on repeat as Thompson spoke. Chloe couldn't stop watching herself on the screen. The determined walk up the driveway, the knife gripped tightly, her wedding dress ghostly white in the porch light. She didn't recognize that woman, yet there she was, evidence she couldn't deny. In the gallery, Ryan's mother sobbed quietly. His father stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. Chloe's parents held hands so tightly their knuckles were white. Everyone in the courtroom could feel it, the moment when sympathy gave way to certainty, when the story of a jilted bride turned into something darker. The jury deliberated for 48 hours. During that time, Chloe sat in a holding cell, picking at the sleeve of her blazer until threads came loose. Her mother brought her food that she couldn't eat. Even Chen seemed nervous, constantly checking her phone for updates from the courthouse. On the morning of the third day, the bailiff announced they had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly, reporters rushing to their seats, spectators jostling for space, both families taking their places in the front rows. The air felt thick with tension. Chloe stood on shaking legs as the jury filed in. She studied their faces, looking for any hint of their decision, but they all kept their eyes down. The foreman handed the verdict to the judge, who read it silently first, his expression giving nothing away. In the matter of State versus Chloe Matthews, on the charge of first-degree murder, the jury finds the defendant not guilty. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Chloe felt her knees weaken. On the charge of second-degree murder, the jury finds the defendant not guilty. Ryan's mother grabbed her husband's arm. On the charge of voluntary manslaughter, the jury finds the defendant guilty. The words seemed to echo in the silent courtroom. Chloe heard her mother's sharp intake of breath, felt Chen's hand steady her elbow. 15 years. She could face up to 15 years. The judge asked if she wanted to make a statement before sentencing. Chloe walked to the podium, her legs somehow carrying her even though she couldn't feel them. She turned to face Ryan's family, The word she'd rehearsed 100 times suddenly stuck in her throat. "I'm sorry," she finally managed, her voice cracking. I never meant for any of this to happen. Ryan didn't deserve to die. Not like that. Not by my hand. I was supposed to love him, and instead She broke down, unable to continue. The judge took into account her lack of prior criminal record and the extreme emotional circumstances. Still, he couldn't ignore the evidence of premeditation, even if it didn't rise to the level of first-degree murder. He sentenced her to 15 years, with the possibility of parole after 10. As the deputies led her away, Chloe caught a final glimpse of the courtroom. Her parents holding each other, crying quietly. Ryan's family huddled together, their faces a mix of relief and lingering grief. The reporters already rushing out to break the news. In the holding cell, while she waited to be transported to the women's prison, Chin visited one last time. "We can appeal," she offered, but they both knew it would be pointless. The evidence was too strong, the sentence fair given the circumstances. "What happens now?" Chloe asked, staring at her reflection in the cell's small mirror. She barely recognized herself anymore. "Now you serve your time," Chin said gently. "And you work on healing. There are programs in prison, therapy, education, job training. Use this time to understand yourself better." The media dubbed it justice served, not too harsh, not too lenient. The wedding day killer would pay for her crime, but the sentence acknowledged the unique circumstances that led to the tragedy. Outside the courthouse, protesters from both sides gradually dispersed. The reporters packed up their cameras. Life in Las Vegas continued. Ryan's mother made a brief statement to the press. "No sentence can bring our son back. But maybe this will help other couples think twice before letting emotions turn to violence." Ryan should have been honest about his feelings. Chloe should have handled her pain differently. Now 2 families are destroyed because of choices that can never be undone. That evening, as Chloe changed into her prison uniform, news channels across the city ran special reports about the case. They showed her wedding photo next to her mugshot, played clips from the trial, interviewed experts about relationship violence and mental health. But for Chloe, alone in her cell, none of that mattered anymore. She had 15 years to think about one moment of rage that had changed everything. 3 years into her sentence at Nevada Women's Correctional Center, Chloe sat in a circle with other inmates, sharing their stories of how they ended up there. Group therapy had become the highlight of her week, a chance to finally understand the person she'd been and the one she wanted to become. "I used to think love meant possession," she told the group, twisting the plain silver ring that had replaced her engagement ring. "Like, if I loved someone enough, I had the right to their whole life. Now I see how toxic that was." The prison counselor, Maria, had worked with Chloe since her first week inside. She'd watched her transform from a shell-shocked new inmate into someone who actively helped others understand their own violent impulses. Chloe started a support group for women who'd committed crimes of passion, trying to help them process their guilt and anger. Her parents visited every month, bringing news from the outside world and updates about her appeal process, though she'd stopped hoping for early release. Her mother had aged 10 years in 3, her father's hair now completely gray. They never talked about the wedding photos they'd packed away or the dreams they'd had for their only daughter. In her cell at night, Chloe wrote letters to Ryan's parents, which she never sent, to her younger self, to the woman she hoped to be when she got out. She took every class the prison offered, earned her counseling certification, started teaching other inmates about emotional regulation and anger management. "You're doing the work," Maria told her during one session. "That's more than most people do on the outside. You're not just serving time, you're using it." But the nightmares never completely stopped. She still woke up sometimes, seeing Ryan's face, feeling the knife in her hand. Those nights, she'd sit on her bunk until dawn, reading the self-help books her counselor recommended, trying to understand the woman who'd walked up that driveway in a wedding dress, carrying death instead of love. Outside the prison walls, the case left lasting ripples through the community. Ryan's parents established the Cooper Foundation for Relationship Violence Prevention, giving talks at colleges about the importance of honest communication and emotional health. They used their tragedy to help others recognize warning signs in themselves and their partners. "We lost our son," Ryan's father told a group of university students, because two people couldn't be honest about their feelings. Ryan should have spoken up sooner. Chloe should have handled rejection differently. Now we're trying to make sure other families don't go through what we did. The foundation partnered with mental health organizations to create programs specifically addressing relationship trauma and abandonment fears. They developed a hotline for people struggling with wedding-related stress and relationship anxiety. Slowly, their work began changing how people viewed emotional violence and its prevention. Local wedding planners started including mental health resources in their packages. Marriage counselors developed new programs focusing on pre-wedding anxiety and communication. The story became a cautionary tale, not just about violence, but about the importance of emotional honesty in relationships. 7 years into her sentence, Chloe received a letter from Ryan's mother. "I'll never forgive what you did," she wrote, "but I know my son wasn't perfect either. I hope you're getting the help you needed back then. I hope you understand now what went wrong." Chloe kept that letter under her pillow, reading it on her hardest days. She'd started writing a memoir about her experience, not to profit from the tragedy, but to help others understand how quickly unchecked emotions could destroy lives. "The worst part," she wrote in her journal, "isn't the time I'm serving. It's knowing that I took someone's life because I couldn't handle my own pain. No sentence will ever be long enough to make that right. All I can do now is try to prevent someone else from making the same mistake." By her 10th year in prison, Chloe had helped dozens of women understand their own violent impulses. She'd earned her bachelor's degree in psychology through a prison education program. The angry bride who'd walked into prison was gone, replaced by someone who understood that love shouldn't hurt, that no relationship was worth destroying lives over. "Your story matters," she told new inmates in her support group. "But it doesn't have to define your whole life. We can't change what we did, but we can change who we become because of it."
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.